There is a pretty misleading video on YouTube where an officer talks about how headshots are no guarantee. He talks about the fact that people have been shot in the head with handguns but have survived. The conclusions he makes with this information, however, are not good, and they are the following. The first being that there are a lot of people walking around today that have been shot in the head. This obviously implies that head wounds with handguns are not that serious. Second, since head wounds with handguns can be ineffective, you should shoot attackers in the chest instead. Third, that all handgun calibers lack the effectiveness to guarantee death with a headshot. Fourth and final, that to have a guaranteed death with a headshot, you need a 308 or larger. He also makes some offhand comment about how this is reality and not a video game, which implies that people dying easily from head wounds is basically only a gameplay mechanic and doesn't really apply to reality. I could easily show you a video game where the enemies take multiple handgun rounds to the head and still keep living. Yet in real life, if you try the same thing on a deer for example, it'll obviously die with the first round. Now, as for this officer, I want to make the point that even intelligent people with plenty of real-world experience can come to believe strange things due to flawed logic. It's a simple fact that most of the people who have been shot in the head with handguns are dead, and it's pretty rare for anyone to survive such a thing. Even with bears, for example, both grizzly and black, they can be reliably killed with good shot placement and 22 rounds. So it's out of the ordinary and worth mentioning when someone like Stephen Camp shoots a bear in the head and the bear doesn't immediately die. This particular round was a 45 grain Winchester rimfire fired from a target-style revolver. The bullet penetrated completely through the brain and both sides of the skull, only to come to rest under the skin on the other side. The bear was down but not dead, so a second shot was needed to finish the job. Now is an excellent time to make the point that a .22 long rifle bullet made out of regular soft lead can penetrate into a cow's skull. However, when you make a round-nose .455 caliber bullet out of that same soft lead and shoot it at 729 feet per second, you end up with a bullet that reliably fails to penetrate thick bone. This became quite apparent during the Thompson-Lagarde tests, which were intended to compare the effectiveness of different handgun calibers. The Thompson-Lagarde report said that the .476 Ely round had the most stopping power and was impressive. They may view it as impressive, but I'd say it's very unimpressive. All 4 rounds that were fired into the head of a cow failed to penetrate into the brain. The reason I'm showing you this chart is because I wanted to illustrate that with common handgun rounds, they not only have enough penetration to enter the skull, but also to exit it as well. There are a lot of violent criminals walking around with 9mm loaded with full metal jackets. In homicides with such rounds, it's common for the bullet to exit the head, especially when fired at close range. After all, the closer the handgun is, the more likely the bullet exits the head. Less powerful cartridges, like 22 and 25 ACP, are much less likely in general to exit. We also have the percentage for suicides as well, which almost all happened at contact distance with the bullet entering through the temple region. So the homicides category would be very similar to defensive shootings because it's people being shot at different distances and different angles. The suicide category would be more like if someone is charging you with a knife and you happen to make a temple shot at contact range or very close range. For this chart, the .357 Magnum and .38 Specials were largely expanding rounds, mostly semi-jacketed hollow points. All the 25 ACPs and most of the 9mm were full metal jackets. All the 22 long rifles were lead. I want to address the idea that you should make a chest shot because a headshot will just deflect off the skull or be generally ineffective. We can debunk that at a statistical level by comparing fatal wounds of the chest and head/neck. With one doctor's personal experience of civilian homicide cases, which means mostly handguns are involved, 40% of fatal wounds involve the brain, while 50% involve the heart or major blood vessels. So even if we totally ignore the relevant point of surface area and the chances of the bullet hitting the organs involved, with the heart or major blood vessels, not just limited to the chest, are only 10% more lethal overall than brain wounds. We also have the Army's study of combat casualties in Vietnam, which means hardly any handgun rounds are involved. The amount of people who die from thorax wounds is basically the same as those who die from neck/head wounds. However, when you take into account the fact that the thorax has twice the surface area as the head/neck, this would imply that it's very likely that more people are getting shot in the thorax, but not dying from those wounds. The locations of the wounds inflicted will vary depending on what war we look at, obviously. For example, the percentage of head wounds increases when you have protracted urban combat. Such urban combat obviously encourages the use of snipers. These are some quotes from a couple podcasts that involve doctors who do facial surgery for gunshot wounds, as well as people like police officers. The first part involves the doctor answering a question about using less effective calibers for brain shots in self-defense. He explains that very rounded, slow bullets tend to deflect off parts of the skull like the forehead. This deflection happens with .45s as well sometimes, but usually with .380s. I should mention that there is a bit of selection bias going on here, because he mentioned that most people he sees getting shot are with smaller calibers like .380. Such handguns are popular with the criminal element in his area because they are small and easily concealed. So .380 full metal jackets are more likely to deflect off bone to begin with, and since there are a lot of people getting shot with such rounds, we see more people surviving in this way. Likewise, we have more examples of such deflection. One was a 200 grain .38 special with a very round nose. The other was a .45 full metal jacket round. So it's very misleading for anyone to say that such deflections are happening because handgun rounds are underpowered. If you want a handgun round that has much better penetration and far less chance of deflection, choose a bullet that has a very flat nose, relatively small diameter, and higher velocity. From that same book that had the skull penetration data, we have a quote that I will prove is wrong. A larger bullet caliber by itself does not increase the chances of through-and-through penetration, also known as perforation. As Elmer Keith explains, the .38 Colt Auto and the .38 Super have better penetration through bone than the .45 Auto. The larger the bullet diameter is, the more force is required to push that bullet the same distance in a hard object like bone. The same effect can be observed with very powerful rifle calibers and elephant skulls. I should also mention that a slow-moving full metal jacket handgun bullet can actually do more damage to bone than a full metal jacket rifle bullet at high velocity. Since the handgun round has lower velocity, it spends more time inside the bone, which gives it more time to transfer its energy into the bone. However, even if you look at the entrance, exit wounds, and the bones themselves, you can't really determine if a 9mm full metal jacket or a .45 full metal jacket made those wounds. The case of a police officer being shot in the legs illustrates this fact. They only really determined that the suspect had shot the officer when they proved that the suspect's rounds were depositing lead when passing through bone. I want to mention a couple cases involving headshots with 7.5mm rifles. The 7.5mm here is comparable in power to a .308 and has only a slightly smaller bullet diameter of .306. The first case was an attempted suicide. The person had the rifle at just the right distance from his head for the bullet to pass cleanly through and do very little damage. The other case involves the same caliber but was a contact wound instead. This resulted in a burst skull and fatality. So even with .308 and similar calibers, death is not always a guarantee with a brain shot. That doesn't mean you should prepare only for the 1% of occurrences instead of the 99%. I would not seriously worry about the possibility that an attacker happens to survive a brain wound and keeps fighting. If you're using the correct ammunition and a reasonably powerful cartridge like 9mm, the chances of this happening are next to nothing. What if it does happen though? Assuming that you can repeat a headshot, basically no one survives 2 handgun rounds to the head. Even if you have a really inadequate cartridge and bullet design, a follow-up shot can still prove to be fatal. In this case, a gang member was shot in the head with a .32 Smith & Wesson full metal jacket. The first round deformed and was totally ineffective. The The second round entered through the temple and caused fatality. Finally, on a slightly different note, there is a video that shows a feral hog taking a 30-30 to the head and running away after being knocked down. Under that video is another person who mentioned the fact that the very same thing happened with a hog shot in the head with a 308 at 30 yards. Is this information going to change the way people choose to hunt hogs? Maybe. I don't think this sort of thing happens enough to be considered a significant problem, though. I also think that many people would not even believe such a thing actually happened if there wasn't video evidence.